She tried human breeding, and now she's addicted to me. 7, he had always lived an ordinary life, doing the same things day in and day out. There was nothing special about him, but everything changed the moment she arrived. She was unlike anyone he had ever met before. Mysterious, intelligent, and strangely alluring. She had a calm demeanor that seemed to hide secrets beyond his understanding. When she appeared at his door, he had no idea that his life would be turned upside down. It all began when she approached him with a proposal that seemed almost too good to be true. She claimed to be a scientist from another world, someone who had been studying human biology for years. She spoke with such confidence, her eyes glinting with a kind of knowledge that intrigued him. She wasn't like anyone he had ever encountered. Despite the oddness of it all, he found himself intrigued, and a part of him wanted to believe her. Her name was not important. At least, it didn't seem to matter at first. What mattered was what she said next. She wanted to conduct an experiment. She explained that she had been studying human genetics for some time, and after extensive research, she believed she had discovered something extraordinary. She wanted him to be a part of her experiment, a scientific study that would change the course of humanity. It sounded insane. He couldn't even begin to understand what she meant. But the more she talked, the more his curiosity grew. She explained that her research involved human reproduction, that she believed humans had a unique genetic potential that she could unlock, and she needed his help to do so. She made it clear that it would be an entirely voluntary process. No harm would come to him, and in return, he would be compensated handsomely for his time. At first, he was skeptical, but she was persuasive. She spoke with authority, and something about her made him feel like he had no choice but to trust her. Her promises of wealth and a place in history were tempting, and soon the idea of being part of something groundbreaking started to take root in his mind. But even with her charm and confidence, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Who would ask a complete stranger to be a part of something so personal? Why did she choose him? He tried to push those thoughts aside. After all, he was a nobody, a man living a quiet life, working a simple job. What did he have to lose? The day of the experiment arrived, and he stood at the entrance to her laboratory, a strange mixture of nerves and anticipation swirling in his chest. He hadn't seen her since that first meeting, and when he finally laid eyes on her again, he couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of curiosity. Her presence was commanding. She was dressed in a lab coat, but there was something about the way she carried herself that made her seem almost regal, as if she belonged to another world entirely. As he entered the lab, he saw all the equipment, machines he didn't recognize, tools that seemed to belong to another era. It looked more like a high-tech science facility than a place where humans were involved in simple research. He hesitated for a moment, wondering if he was making a mistake. But it was too late to back out now. She had already taken him this far, and there was no turning back. She led him to a chair in the center of the room, her gaze fixed on him with a mix of curiosity and something else, something that made his heart beat faster. It wasn't just science that drove her. There was something deeper, something more personal in her eyes. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice steady but with an undercurrent of something he couldn't place. He nodded, feeling both eager and uncertain. The whole situation felt unreal, like he was caught in some strange dream. She smiled slightly, and the room seemed to fall silent around them. She was calm, too calm. And as she began explaining the procedure, he tried to focus on the technicalities. She reassured him that everything would be safe, that he was in good hands. The first stage of the experiment was simple, analyzing his genetic material. He was asked to undergo a few basic tests. The machines around him hummed and beeped as she worked, studying the results with intensity. "What are you looking for?" he asked, genuinely curious but also starting to feel the weight of the situation. She glanced up at him, her eyes softening for a brief moment. "Human potential," she said simply. "Your genetics have something that's different. Something that could change the future of my world." He didn't fully understand. but there was no denying the mystery in her words. The concept of his genes being so important was both flattering and unnerving. He tried to push aside the discomfort that gnawed at him, focusing instead on the strange bond that seemed to be forming between them. She wasn't like anyone he had ever met. Her intelligence was overwhelming, but it was the way she looked at him, almost like she saw something in him that no one else did, that kept him coming back. As the days went on, the experiments became more involved. Each time he returned to her lab, the process grew more complex, and the connection between them seemed to deepen. He started noticing the little things, how she would smile when he answered a question correctly, the way her eyes would linger on him for just a moment too long when they were alone. There was a chemistry between them that he hadn't expected, and it made his heart race in a way that was hard to ignore. But he also began to sense that something was changing in her. At first it was subtle, a brief hesitation in her voice when she explained the next phase of the experiment, a slight unease when she looked at the results. It was almost as if the scientist, who had once been so focused on her work, was starting to question her own intentions. He wasn't sure what to make of it. The idea that he could be more than just a subject in her experiment, that there was something between them that went beyond science, unsettled him. She had promised that everything would be professional, but now he couldn't ignore the growing tension. The more time he spent with her, the more he felt drawn to her. Yet at the same time, he was starting to realize that she might be just as drawn to him. One evening, after another round of tests, she asked him to stay a little longer. The lab was quiet, the hum of the machines the only sound filling the room. She studied the results, her expression unreadable. When she looked up at him, her gaze was intense. "You're more than I expected," she said softly. Her voice was almost a whisper. He didn't know how to respond. The words seemed too personal, too revealing for someone who had always kept his emotions tightly controlled. But something in the way she spoke made his heart skip a beat.
"More than you expected?" he echoed, trying to keep his voice steady.
She nodded, but didn't elaborate. Instead, she turned back to the data on the screen in front of her. The atmosphere in the room shifted, a quiet tension settling over them both. As he left the lab that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything was changing. What had started as a simple scientific experiment had turned into something else entirely. He had never expected to form a connection with her, much less one that seemed to be growing stronger with every passing day. But now he couldn't help but wonder, was he just a part of her experiment? Or was there something more, something deeper, that neither of them had anticipated? The question swirled in his mind as he walked away from the lab, but one thing was certain: his life would never be the same again. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing moment, the experiments became more intense. At first, the man had been unsure about the whole process, but over time he found himself drawn deeper into her world. Every test, every procedure had a purpose, and he could see that it wasn't just about science for her anymore. There was something more, something personal. The way she looked at him now, the way her voice softened when she spoke to him. It was clear that there was a connection growing between them, one that neither of them had expected. She had been upfront about the nature of her research. She needed his genetic material for her study, and everything was supposed to be clinical. But as he spent more time in her lab, he began to feel like more than just a subject in an experiment. There was an emotional charge that had begun to form between them, and it was hard for him to ignore. She had started to share more about herself, too. Though she was still a mystery in many ways, she opened up to him little by little. It was as if the boundaries of their professional relationship were slowly dissolving. The cold, clinical atmosphere of the lab seemed to fade away whenever they were together. She no longer acted like just a scientist. She seemed more like a person, someone he could talk to, someone who made him feel something more than just curiosity. There was warmth in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a softness that made him question if she had truly meant to be this close to him. The first time he noticed it clearly was during a particularly difficult test. They had been working for hours, running genetic sequences and analyzing data. He had grown tired, But she was as focused as ever. She glanced up at him, her gaze lingering for a moment longer than usual. She was still studying the results, but there was something different in the way she looked at him.
"How are you feeling?" she asked, her voice unexpectedly gentle. It wasn't just a question about his physical state, he could tell.
There was something more in her tone, something that made him pause. He had never imagined that she would care about his well-being in that way. After all, he was just a part of her experiment, or so he had thought. "I'm okay," he replied, trying to sound casual. But there was a flutter in his chest, and he couldn't quite explain it. She smiled faintly, as though she knew exactly what he was feeling. Made him uncomfortable, but in a way that kept him wanting more of her attention. The experiment had taken a different turn after that day. The tests grew more detailed, more personalized. She began to monitor his reactions more closely, not just to the physical aspects of the experiments, but to his emotions as well. It was as if she was learning more about him than he had expected, studying how he responded to her presence, to her voice, to the way she moved around him. It felt strange, like he was no longer just a subject, but a part of something else, something that went beyond science. Every time he returned to the lab, there was an unspoken tension between them. He could see it in the way she approached him, in the way she spoke to him. The sterile walls of the lab couldn't hide the connection that was slowly forming. She wasn't just observing him anymore. She was feeling something for him. And he, despite his best efforts, was starting to feel the same way. One evening, after another round of tests, she asked him to stay longer. He didn't question her, just followed her as she led him to a quieter part of the lab. It was a small room, dimly lit by a few monitors. The soft hum of the machines was the only sound filling the space as she turned to face him. "I need to know something," she said, her voice steady but with a hint of uncertainty. He raised an eyebrow, intrigued but cautious. "What do you need to know?" She hesitated for a moment, her eyes searching his face.
I need to know if you feel it too.
The question hung in the air, and for a moment he didn't know how to answer. He could feel the pull between them, the growing tension, but he had no idea what she meant. He had never expected any of this. He had come here to help her with a simple experiment, but it felt like he was now part of something much bigger. And in that moment, he wasn't sure if it was just science or something more. "I don't know what you mean," he said, his voice betraying a hint of uncertainty. She stepped closer, and he could feel the space between them closing. "This, whatever this is between us," she said, her eyes locked onto his. "It's not just about the experiment, is it?" The words hit him harder than he had expected. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. His mind raced, and for the first time he realized that he wasn't just a part of her study anymore. He was a part of something deeper, something neither of them could control. Her eyes softened as she took a step back, as though giving him space to process what she had just said. She didn't push him for an answer, just waited. He could see the vulnerability in her, the same vulnerability he had started to feel. She wasn't just the confident scientist anymore. She was a person just like him, struggling with emotions she hadn't expected to encounter. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, her voice tinged with regret. "I didn't mean to make things complicated." But it already was complicated. He couldn't deny it. The attraction between them was undeniable, and the more time he spent with her, the harder it was to pretend that he was just a subject in an experiment. The line between science and something more had blurred, and neither of them could figure out how to untangle it. He didn't know how to respond, so he stayed silent, unsure of what to say. She had just revealed something that he hadn't been ready for. He had thought he was helping her with a project, something simple and straightforward, but it was far more complex than he had realized. And now, he was tangled in something that went beyond science, beyond logic. He was tangled in emotions that neither of them could control. The rest of the evening passed in a quiet, uncomfortable silence. He could feel the tension in the air as she worked silently at her station, stealing glances at him every now and then. The connection between them was still there, hanging in the air like an invisible thread, waiting to be acknowledged. But neither of them knew how to address it. As he left the lab that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that things had changed. This wasn't just an experiment anymore. They were both caught in something that neither of them could control, and for the first time, he wasn't sure where it would lead. As the days went on, the quiet tension between them continued to grow. At first, the man had told himself it was just the nature of the experiment. He was simply a participant, and she was a scientist. There was no need to make things more complicated than they already were. But as time passed, it became harder to deny that there was something else happening. He had never felt this way before, and it wasn't just about the experiment anymore. There was a connection, something deeper that neither of them could ignore. She had always been focused, professional, and distant. But little by little, those walls started to come down. He began to notice how her gaze lingered just a little longer than necessary, how her smile, once reserved for the scientific results, now appeared more personal. She would ask him how he was feeling more often, not just in relation to the tests, but in general, as if she was concerned about his well-being, in a way that went beyond the experiment. It was subtle at first, but it didn't take long for him to realize that she was becoming more than just his experimenter. She was becoming something more to him, too. Every time he saw her, the connection between them seemed to grow stronger. It wasn't just the physical attraction that made him feel this way. It was the emotional pull that he couldn't explain. He tried to focus on the experiment, to keep his mind on the task at hand. After all, that was why he was there. She had made it clear from the beginning that this was about science, nothing more. But despite his best efforts, his thoughts kept drifting back to her. The way she moved, the way she spoke, everything about her drew him in. One day, after another round of tests, she asked him to stay a little longer. Her tone was casual, but there was something about the way she asked that made him pause. He could feel the weight of the unspoken words between them. Something had shifted between them, and neither of them knew how to address it. He agreed to stay, though a part of him wasn't sure why. He had come to the lab for something entirely different, but now it felt like there was more at stake. He wasn't sure if it was the experiment or something deeper that kept him coming back. They sat together in the quiet of the lab, the soft hum of the machines filling the silence. She had been looking at some data on her screen, but now she turned her attention to him. Her expression was thoughtful, almost distant, as if she was weighing something in her mind. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "About everything? About this experiment? And about us?" The words hung in the air, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. He wasn't sure what to say. He had been trying to push his own feelings aside, focusing on the task at hand. But now, hearing her voice, it felt like everything was suddenly clearer. There was something she wasn't saying, something more than just the science. He could feel it in the way she was looking at him. She was as conflicted as he was. "I don't know what's happening between us," she continued, her gaze dropping to her hands. "But it's not just about the experiment anymore. I never expected this connection." The words hit him harder than he expected. He had been feeling it too, but hearing her admit it out loud made it all the more real. He had tried to ignore the way she made him feel, tried to convince himself that it was just the circumstances, but now he realized that it wasn't just that. There was something between them, something that neither of them had planned for. He didn't know what to say in response. Part of him wanted to confess that he felt the same way, but another part of him was afraid. Afraid of what it meant, afraid of how much it could complicate everything. He had never imagined that something as simple as participating in an experiment could turn into something so personal.
"I didn't mean for it to happen like this,"
she said, her voice soft. "I never expected to feel this way. I don't know what this means for us, for the experiment, but I can't pretend it's just science anymore." It was a vulnerable moment, and he could see the uncertainty in her eyes. She was just as unsure of what was happening as he was. and for the first time, it felt like they were on the same page. She wasn't just the scientist anymore. She was a person, someone who had feelings, and wasn't immune to the connection between them. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing heart. "I don't know what to say either," he admitted. "But I feel it too. I can't deny it." Her eyes softened, and for a moment, it felt like the weight of the world had been lifted from their shoulders. They were no longer hiding from the truth, no longer pretending that this was just about an experiment. The connection between them was real, and it had grown too strong to ignore. But even as they sat there, their emotions tangled together. A part of him couldn't help but wonder what this would mean. They were in uncharted territory now, and neither of them knew how to navigate it. Could they continue the experiment knowing how deep their feelings had become? Could they go back to pretending it was just science when everything between them had changed? "I don't want this to ruin everything," she said, almost as if reading his thoughts. "I don't want to lose what we've built here." He nodded, understanding what she meant. The experiment had always been important, and it had brought them together in a way neither of them could have expected. But now, it felt like everything was hanging in the balance. They couldn't just go back to how things were before. Their connection had changed everything. "I don't want to lose it either," he said quietly, "but I don't know where this is going." There was a long pause, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with unspoken emotions, and neither of them seemed ready to take the next step. It was a moment of uncertainty, but also a moment of clarity. They both understood now that they couldn't ignore what had grown between them. She stood up from her chair and walked over to the desk, her hands shaking slightly as she collected the data they had been working on. He watched her for a moment, unsure of what to do. Part of him wanted to reach out, to say something to make everything clearer, but another part of him knew that they both needed time to process everything that had happened. "I think we need to take a step back," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to figure out what this means, what we both want. But I can't pretend anymore." He stood up slowly, feeling the weight of her words settle over him. He didn't want to take a step back, didn't want to stop what had started between them, but he understood that they needed time to figure it out. They couldn't keep going down this path without understanding where it would lead.
"Okay," he said quietly. "Let's take a step back."
"But we'll figure this out." As he left the lab that evening, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed. The connection between them had shifted something inside of him, something that he wasn't sure he could control. But for the first time, he felt like he wasn't alone in this confusion. She felt it too, and together, they would have to figure out what came next. The following days felt different. The air between them seemed heavier, filled with an unspoken tension that neither of them knew how to address. They had stepped into uncharted territory, and there was no going back. The experiment, which had once been the center of their relationship, now felt secondary to the emotions they were both trying to navigate. She had been distant after their conversation, not cold, but more reserved. She no longer looked at him with the same intensity, though the softness in her eyes was still there. The professional walls she had once carefully maintained were no longer as firm. It was clear that the boundary between scientist and subject had blurred, and now they both had to deal with the consequences. For the first time, he found himself wondering what she was thinking. She had always been so confident, so controlled. But now, it seemed like she was uncertain about everything. She was the one who had invited him into her world, who had started this experiment, but now it felt as if she was unsure of how to continue, unsure of how to balance the professional and personal feelings that were now tangled between them. He spent the next few days trying to focus on the work, but it was hard. Every time he stepped into the lab, the air was thick with something unspoken. Every glance, every word she said felt loaded with meaning. It was as if both of them were afraid to break the fragile silence that had settled between them. They spoke mostly about the experiments keeping things professional, but it was clear that there was more beneath the surface. He was conflicted. He wanted to get closer to her, to understand what was happening between them. But at the same time, he knew that this wasn't just about him. She had to be struggling with her own feelings, her own doubts. The experiment was supposed to be something scientific, something logical, but now it was tangled up with emotions that neither of them had expected. One day, after another test, she surprised him. She asked him to sit with her, just to talk. There was no lab equipment, no data to analyze, just the two of them, sitting in the quiet of the room. She didn't seem like the confident scientist who had first approached him. She seemed vulnerable, in a way that he hadn't seen before. "I've been thinking," she started, her voice low and uncertain. "I don't know where this is going. I don't know how to continue the experiment with everything that's happened. It's not just the science anymore. It's us." He looked at her, unsure of what to say. She was still the same person, the same scientist, but in this moment, she felt different. She was opening up to him, and it felt like a side of her that she had kept hidden for so long was now exposed. And for the first time, he felt like he wasn't the only one confused by what was happening. "I feel the same way," he admitted, his voice almost a whisper. "I don't know where this is going either. I thought it was just an experiment, but now I can't ignore what's between us." She nodded slowly, her eyes searching his face. There was a sadness in her gaze, as if she was mourning the loss of something she hadn't even realized was so important to her. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't mean to get attached," she said softly. "But now it feels like I've lost control." He felt his heartache as he watched her struggle. He had always seen her as the one in control, the one who knew what she was doing. But now, she seemed lost, just like him. They were both caught up in something they didn't fully understand, something that had gone beyond the scope of the experiment. "It's not just you," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "I'm not in control of this either. I don't know what's happening, but I can't ignore it. We're both in this together." For a moment, neither of them spoke. It was as if the weight of the words they had shared had settled between them, making everything else feel distant. They were no longer just a scientist and a subject. They were two people, connected by something far more complicated than either of them had anticipated. She reached out and touched his hand, a small gesture, but one that meant more than anything they had shared before. It was a silent admission that, for the first time, they were acknowledging what had grown between them. There were no more walls, no more pretending that this was just about science. It was about them and the feelings they were both trying to come to terms with. "I don't know how to fix this," she whispered, her fingers lightly tracing his hand. "I don't know if we can go back to how things were before." "I don't think we can," he replied honestly. "But maybe that's okay. Maybe it's time we figured out what this is, instead of pretending." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of doubt. But all she saw was sincerity. He wasn't just saying the right things, he meant them. He wasn't sure where this would go, but he wasn't afraid anymore. He wasn't afraid of the unknown, of the messiness that came with being human. He was ready to face it all with her. "I don't want to lose this," she said quietly. "I don't want to lose what we have, even if it's complicated." He gave her a reassuring smile. "We don't have to lose it. We just have to figure out how to move forward." She smiled back, and for the first time in days, there was a sense of relief in the room. It wasn't going to be easy, and they still had a lot to figure out. But they were no longer pretending. They were no longer trying to separate the experiment from what they felt for each other. They had crossed that line, and now they had to find their way together. As he left the lab that evening, a weight seemed to lift from his shoulders. The uncertainty was still there, but it was different now. It wasn't the fear of the unknown that weighed on him. It was the excitement of what was to come. He didn't know what their future held, but he knew that they would face it together. It wasn't just about the experiment anymore. It was about them, and the connection they had found in the most unexpected of places. The days that followed were filled with uncertainty. Both of them knew that their relationship, whatever it had become, was fragile. They had crossed boundaries they hadn't planned on crossing, and now they were standing at a crossroads. The experiment was still ongoing, but it had become less about science and more about understanding each other. They had stepped into a territory neither of them had prepared for, and there was no easy way to move forward. The man tried to focus on the original purpose of his involvement, helping her with her research. But it wasn't just about that anymore. Every time he entered the lab, the quiet tension between them returned, a weight he couldn't shake off. He wasn't sure what he was feeling, but it wasn't just the pull of curiosity. It was something deeper, something more complicated than he had imagined. And he could see that she was going through the same turmoil. She had always been composed, confident in her work, but now she seemed just as lost as he was. There were moments when she would catch him staring at her, and their eyes would meet in a silent understanding. It wasn't the same anymore. They both knew that. She was no longer just the scientist conducting a study. She was someone who had become entangled in this with him, someone whose emotions were now in the mix, and so were his. After their last conversation, things had changed. They hadn't discussed what happened between them in the lab after that night, but it was clear that they both understood what needed to happen next. They needed to face whatever feelings had developed between them. They couldn't keep pretending that everything was business as usual. There was more at stake now. One evening, as they sat in the lab, the man looked at her and saw a new kind of uncertainty in her eyes. She had always been the one with all the answers, the one who led the way. But now, there was a hesitancy in her demeanor that mirrored his own. "I've been thinking a lot about everything," she said quietly, breaking the silence. "I know we've crossed some lines, and I don't know what to do about it." He sighed, rubbing his forehead as the weight of everything settled on him. "I don't know what to do either," he admitted. "It feels like we're caught between what we wanted this to be and what it's become, and neither of us knows how to move forward." She nodded, slowly. "I don't want to lose what we've built, but I also don't want to make things worse. I care about you more than I thought I would, but I can't just throw everything away. I don't want to hurt you or myself." Her words struck him in a way he didn't expect. He had been afraid that she would want to pull away, that this whole thing would end badly, but now hearing her admit that she cared about him made everything feel more real. She wasn't just the scientist anymore. She was someone who was just as confused, just as invested in what was happening between them. "I care about you too," he said, his voice steady. "And I don't want to hurt either of us either. But we can't keep pretending that this is just about the experiment anymore. We need to figure out what this means for both of us." They sat in silence for a while, both of them thinking about what to say next. The tension that had built between them over the past few weeks had reached a breaking point. They couldn't keep ignoring what had happened, what was happening, but neither of them was sure if they were ready to face the consequences. Finally, she spoke again. "Maybe we need to take a break, a real one. Not just in the lab, but from all of this. We need time to think about what we really want, what this is, and what we want it to be." He felt a pang of disappointment at the thought. He didn't want to step away from her, but he understood why she was suggesting it. They both needed space to think. They couldn't keep going like this, running around in circles, afraid to face the truth. "I think you're right," he said softly. "Maybe we need to take a step back, figure things out. It's not about ending everything. It's just about getting some perspective. I don't want to rush anything, especially not something this important." She smiled faintly, a small but genuine smile.
"I don't either," she said, her voice softening. "This isn't something to rush."
"We need time to be sure that we're doing what's best for us. And for the experiment." They both knew that the experiment wasn't the priority anymore, but neither of them wanted to admit it out loud. It had been the reason they were brought together, the reason they had spent so much time in the lab, and in many ways, it had been the catalyst for everything that had happened. But now, it felt like the experiment had taken a back seat to something more complicated, something more personal. They had to confront the reality of their situation, and that meant stepping away from the microscope for a while. Over the next few days, they kept their distance. The man spent more time alone, trying to sort through his feelings. The time away from her was both painful and necessary. He had to figure out what he truly wanted. Was he willing to take a risk on something that could end in disaster? Or was it better to walk away before things became too complicated? Meanwhile, she focused on the data they had already collected, trying to make sense of the experiment. But she too knew that she needed time to process everything. The emotional side of things was just as complicated as the scientific, and no matter how much she tried to convince herself that the experiment was still her priority, she couldn't ignore the fact that something real, something unexpected, had happened between them. By the end of the week, they both knew what they had to do. They met in the lab, each of them unsure of how to begin. The silence between them was thick, but it was different this time. It wasn't the awkward silence of uncertainty. It was the silence of two people who had reached a mutual understanding, even if they hadn't fully figured everything out. "We can't keep pretending this isn't happening," she said quietly, breaking the silence.
I think we both know that, he nodded. I think we've both made our feelings clear.
"But we still need to figure out what happens next. We need to take this one step at a time." They both understood that things weren't going to be easy, and that there would be a lot more conversations ahead. But they also knew that they couldn't walk away from what had happened. They had to see where it went, together. And with that, they decided to move forward. Slowly, cautiously, but with the understanding that whatever happened next, they would face it as a team. No longer just a scientist and a subject, but two people trying to figure out what came next in this complicated, unpredictable journey they had started.